From fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada, this is Pod Therapy. Real people, real problems, real therapists, and in today's episode, a real live belt and suspenders lawyer. Welcome, Andrew Torrez, officially the first and only lawyer ever to appear on Pod Therapy and co-host of Opening Arguments, Jim's favorite podcast. Andrew, thank you so much for being on the show. I'm so excited to have you.
Oh, Jim, thank you so much for inviting me. I am a big fan of the show, and I appreciate the kind words. That's you can't see it, but I'm blushing here. So thank you.
Well, I highly doubt it, but you're generous, sir. So for the listeners who don't already know, shame on you. Opening Arguments is the best legal podcast that I have ever heard. And, you know, a lot of legal podcasts can get in there and be really detailed and sometimes be really boring. This podcast, Opening Arguments, is not only entertaining, it is incredibly informative. Andrew, I don't know when you find time to run your practice and see your clients, because every episode is so rich, and Thomas is always teasing you like, Andrew, we got to move on, you know, you got a lot more to cover. And man, how much time do you put into researching for your show?
So seriously, it's about a 20-hour-a-week commitment. That is most of Wednesday night and all of Thursday morning are the times that I block out to sit down and read cases and that sort of thing. And then we record 2 episodes back-to-back Thursday afternoon. The rapid response episode that goes out on Friday, those are usually... They've been
Holy
kind
cow.
of Trump focused since, you know, I mean, only since January of 2017. So
Yeah.
And then
well, hopefully it comes to an end soon and we can get back to baseball law.
I'm very passionate about baseball law, but no, I mean, look, like the show started in August of 2016, and we, you know, kind of had this high-minded idea that we wanted to do, you know, kind of like an online law school, right? It's why we do Thomas Takes the Bar Exam at the end, and the idea is to, you know, to demystify talking about the law. You know, it would be weird to, right, do an episode and explain, well, this is what a subpoena is, right? And not talk about the fact that, you know, and here's the inherent power of Congress to, you know, to enforce it, and not talk about the fact that, you know, that we have executive branch officials that are defying lawfully issued subpoenas, right? Like, we need to explain that in the context of what's actually going on in the world.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
You know, one of the things I was telling my co-host Nick as I was trying to explain what Opening Arguments is, I said, you know, it's one part law show, it's one part, you know, political show, and it's one part the prophetic abilities of The Simpsons. You guys have been calling stuff left and right. You guys have become a national sensation whenever you called the Stormy Daniels legal defense and predicted well in advance exactly methodically what it was going to force the Trump team to do. And ultimately, that did unfold into the conviction of Michael Cohen and all these other things. And then more recently, you also called way in advance, and I was just tweeting about this. I remember back in February, Andrew, you called the Alabama abortion law almost exactly as it ended up being written, because you expected it to go all the way to the Supreme Court, and that was the point, is that they were looking for an opportunity to have something just like this go back up to a very friendly Supreme Court for conservative justices. You guys have you have an incredible crystal ball, man. Whatever you're using, you need to share it.
Well, that you're very kind.
That's what 80 hours of research will get you, Jim.
What we look for on stories are, you know, the Stormy Daniels, right? Like, that was really, I'm trying to find something that I can say that's not perfect storm, so that doesn't, you know, cause the terrible pun.
Let's just do it.
But no, that's really like the classic OA story, right? It's something that I have. So, you know, we've got folks who volunteer and folks who work for us, and so one of our researchers had sent me. I was actually on vacation. I was visiting my family. I was down in Florida visiting my parents who live in a retirement community down there, and I was going through. It was early in the weekend, so I was sort of sorting through a lot of the stuff that was on my radar. And the Stormy Daniels story, the very first mention of it, was entirely kind of came across, and I put it in a folder, and I was reading it late at night and thinking, oh well, it's got a legal angle, it's got the little titillating angle, that sort of thing, and everybody was talking about, is this thing going to be enforceable because there isn't a signature on it, right? I mean, and as I'm reading it, I realized, oh, this is, nobody understands that the real issue here is not at all about the signature and who's but is the fact that this is being called a non-disclosure agreement when this is a settlement agreement, right? And
wow.
And the distinction between those two, right? And a non-disclosure agreement is what you have someone sign when somebody can sign a non-disclosure agreement when there's nothing that as an underlying issue, right? Like,
right.
You can say, "Hey, look, I don't want you to say anything about me," right? And so this happens.
I've signed lots of NDAs in healthcare. Oh yeah,
exactly, right. And so,
in
particularly, when people part on less than good terms, you just it's standard legal practice, and so it didn't rise to the level of anyone's radar, but when you have a mutual settlement agreement, in order for that contract to be legally binding, both sides have to be giving up something, right? And so if the story is, oh, well, this was all just a made up and we just wanted to, then you couldn't execute a settlement agreement, right? And that was kind of the moment where the light bulb went off. And so we continue to look for those kinds of stories that are out there, that are starting to get attention, that are being misreported, and to just kind of find the one little simple answer of, hey, look, here's what they're missing, and here's how you can be out in front of it. So
you guys have caught so many things, and I got a lot of fatigue with political news, and then you have your political shows that advocate for a more progressive view, things like Pod Save America, which I really enjoyed, and then I kind of got burned out. It was a little fatiguey. Your stuff was always so fresh because yes, you had your opinion, yes, you knew who you were rooting for, but it always you were always very careful to accurately explain to us as an audience exactly what the likelihood of anything was. And if that was a bummer, it was a bummer, but you didn't just play to what we wanted to hear. You'd tell it straight. And I think that kind of lawyerly sensibility to be accurate, it really kind of phases into even what brings you and I here today to talk together. I kind of jumped the rails from just being one of your regular fans to being somebody who started reaching out to you because I became more interested in this conversation about not only, Donald Trump, the criminal, Donald Trump, the president, but Donald Trump, the potentially mentally ill person. And there became this debate in my profession that's kind of spilled onto the national stage, which is, should a psychotherapist or some kind of licensed mental health provider, should that person be allowed to diagnose a professional politician, somebody who's been elected in office? And it's been a very interesting debate that's happening here in the present. But I had written into your show once saying, gosh, this harkens back to another presidential, at the time, candidate, Barry Goldwater, and my profession being drug into that. And I had said, gosh, Andrew, I'd love to take a look at this with you and kind of learn through you some of the finer details of this, because what has now become the Goldwater rule is really a tenet of orthodoxy now in mental health and in healthcare generally. And so here we find ourselves at a pinch point, and I think you and I probably find ourselves of different opinions on the matter, but I want to see if I can learn from you and kind of reveal to the audience a little bit more about this particular legal matter, which, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that it was a real case, and I think it was Goldwater versus Ginsburg, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was indeed. It was a libel case brought by Barry Goldwater. and that it went all the way up to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the federal court that is just below the Supreme Court, right? And the Supreme Court is a cert court, so in other words, they don't take every case that comes up. They get to choose, and they chose to let this one stand.
Wow.
So Barry Goldwater sued a guy named Ralph Ginsburg and his colleague, someone named Warren Borison, and their publication, which was called Fact Magazine, Inc.
That sounds reliable.
Yeah, right. We can talk about that. But first, I mean, I want to pick your brain, your expertise. I would, well, in fact, let me not even say what I would do. How would you summarize the Goldwater rule?
Okay, so being a non-legal expert, the way that we generally are taught to understand it, and just kind of from my own cursory reading, what you have in this case is a politician, Barry Goldwater, running for president, and psychiatrists at the time, about 1,000 of them, answer a survey sent out by Fact Magazine that speaks to, do you think that Barry Goldwater is mentally fit for office? Now, their answers heavily influenced the public, and Goldwater ultimately sued. In reaction, the American Psychiatric Association and the American Psychological Association issued a basic rule that said to us as practitioners, you do not diagnose a public figure or anybody that you have not personally evaluated. And so this rule for us in the field has really endured the test of time. It prevents us from getting on TV and diagnosing every celebrity who has a meltdown. It prevents us from discussing, politicians or lawmakers or characterizing certain things with mental health language. And it really forces us to stay in the clinic and treat people one-on-one. So that seems to be the spirit of the rule.
Okay, and I want to talk about the historical Goldwater case, but first, I think I'd like to know sort of the contours of a couple of the words that you used there, right? So the first phrase that you used was to diagnose someone. And I guess my question would be, what counts to you for purpose? This is an ethical rule, right? Like this is not, I know psychiatrists have resigned from the APA over the Goldwater rule. I don't have a name off the top of my head, but I've seen that. But This is an ethics rule, right? It's not an enforced rule, or is it? Right? I mean, can you have your license suspended?
This is a good question, and so this is probably what separates our professions. Is that in your profession, you can be disbarred, right, which is the losing of your ability to practice your profession, and that's going to be based on a state's requirements, isn't it? Now, are those requirements the same in all 50 states, or does it go state by state?
No, it goes state by state. So
right, and then you have your general, ethics that your profession would say are best practices, things you succumb to. In healthcare, you're going to have your boards, which are going to govern your license in your state in much the same way as the lawyer world. But those boards are often going to have regulations which defer not to specific ethical codes, but to the judgment of best practices. And so I believe when you're disbarred by a jury of your peers, right? It's other lawyers that are deciding what you did was wrong. In our field, it's the same. And so ultimately you are governed by the perspectives of other clinicians and their belief of whether what you did was best practices or not. So to answer the question, can a person lose their license for diagnosing somebody in violation of the ethical code? It is not likely that they would lose their license for it, no, unless they were also doing other things.
Got it. And I would say that analogy to being disbarred is remains pretty close. I mean, one of the things I've talked about on opening arguments is that lawyers typically do not get disbarred for malpractice. Lawyers get disbarred for commingling or otherwise abusing client funds.
Right.
And that's, there are exceptions. For example, we just saw with Paul Manafort got disbarred for crimes of moral turpitude. So, there are extreme limits, but I would say the same thing, right? Like that lawyers who violate a particular ethics rule or fail to live up to best practices, that standing alone probably isn't enough to get you disbarred. But went down a rabbit trail. I apologize. Let's go back. What counts? First question for me to you. What counts as a diagnosis? And let me put an example on it. If you say, "Boy, Donald Trump seems like he's nuts," right? Like is that right? How precise do you have to be with your what counts as rendering a diagnosis?
So generally speaking, and this is where it gets a little tricky, because if you ask most clinicians, our answer is going to include the way you arrived at those words, not just the words you chose to use, but the method you arrived at them with. And so that's usually going to require some kind of actual assessment. Now, there are those among us, like Dr. Bandy X. Lee, who would say, okay, well, you can kind of sum up this person based on public footage and clips and interviews and things like that, and then you can render a diagnosis, which for most of us is going to be using a phrase or a word that we consider medical language. And so, and this is true of all healthcare, not just my part of it, but generally speaking, we're going to point to some kind of malady or dysfunction that we do have a word for that has specific criteria that the patient has met in the opinion of an expert who evaluated them. That's usually what a diagnosis is.
Okay. And so now, I mean, let me ask it this way. All of us, I think, in our daily lives, where you have expertise, right? You bring that expertise and you bring your history to bear on evaluating new situations. I'll give you an example. My son, 16, is very ADHD. He when not medicated, he does not get pain signals reliably, right? So, so very, very extreme on that spectrum. And one of the first things and so my wife and I have been dealing with this since he was about 5 when these symptoms started manifesting themselves. And so in day-to-day life, right, my wife will often, kind of look at me and be like, oh, I bet, that person has ADHD. And in fact, right, directly related to this, she's said that about Donald Trump, right? Like when the guy who ghost wrote The Art of the Deal was talking about how Trump, will not sit still in a room, and if a phone call's longer than 30 minutes in length, he sort of gets up, gets bored, and wanders off, right? It was based on her experience, right? She's not a physician, but she says, look, like, I've been dealing with this, and this kind of looks like, I'm not saying with 100% certainty that I am diagnosing Donald Trump as having, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but I'm saying, based on my experience, this sure looks like a lot of the shared symptoms. And when you look at like the DSM-5, right? Like the way, and again, I'm asking this as a question, but as a layperson to the field, right? It looks like the way in which mental health issues are diagnosed are through there'll be like 12 potential symptoms, and it will say, and if somebody is physically displaying 8 of these, then that is typically rises to the level of us rendering a diagnosis or something like that. So put all of that together. I guess the first question would be, do you find that you have that intuitions, right? Like if you're kind of wandering around or, watching someone on TV, not the president, right? But, a crowd or, you're at a party or something like that.
Sure.
Do you bring your expertise and history to bear? And, let me go with that one first.
So I think the question there is, when I'm out in the wild, if I encounter somebody who my brain detects and I look at that person and think, oh, this is probably somebody who has autism spectrum disorder or something else more specific. Right. Would I acknowledge that in my own mind is the question, is am I able to detect that in the wild? Right. Yes, okay. I am.
And so then I guess the question that naturally follows from that is there something would you extend the Goldwater rule to a more general proposition, something that says, okay, you've recognized in your mind, well, I am interacting with this person. They look like they're on the autism spectrum. I wouldn't say I'm going to put 100% confidence interval on it because they're not my patient. I'm not diagnosing them in a formal sort of way. But yeah, I'm pretty confident with my judgment on this because I'm a professional. I've been doing this for a long time. Is that also ethically wrong in your view, or does it transform because of the public character of the president as opposed to just guy in a bar?
I think it's a good question, and I think that this is where I can see where it kind of conflates on a couple of different levels. If I'm able to detect a person's weaknesses or their medical issues, it is considered improper and really unethical for me to discuss that situation with anybody anywhere, unless I'm discussing it with another medical colleague for the purposes of training or education. If I met, a child, a 16-year-old who had ADHD, and then I went around blabbing about, that kid that delivers the newspaper to me definitely has this issue, I know I'm a shrink, that's considered unethical. And it really comes down to the Hippocratic Oath, which is I should do no harm, and in no way does this person stand to benefit from me talking about them in this way. I could potentially harm them.
Okay, so I agree. I'm 100% on board, but let me make the hypothetical more difficult. You have a close friend. And you and she have been friends for a long time, and she introduces you to the guy that she's dating, and you meet the guy and you say, boy, this guy seems like he has all of the standard symptoms of, kind of classic narcissism, right? And I know as a professional that that could be really devastating for my friend to be caught up in a relationship with somebody who's a narcissist, right? Like those people, tend to be. I mean, I don't want to. I'm not going to opine here on your profession, but
Sure.
So now, I mean, would you feel ethically? Because I obviously totally get the Hippocratic Oath issue, but would you feel appropriate to pull your friend aside and go, "Hey, look, you introduced me to Bob, and I got to tell you, Bob raises a lot of red flags for me." Is that unethical?
I'll be completely honest with you, and this is not me being evasive, though your son and I have in common that we are both high school debate champions. So this cross-examination is doing very good. But I'll tell you this, I did not mean to be evasive and dodge the question on this, but honestly, with all of my heart, the correct and normal response from at least this clinician, and there's a lot of us and we do different things, I would pull my friend aside and say, so, tell me about what you see in John. What do you like about him? And I would take a look at it from that angle. And here's the reason why, specifically and writ large, we can use this in a micro way or a macro way. Let's give the woman the name Jessica, and let's give the guy the name John. If I said, Jessica, we need to talk. John has a mental illness, and that mental illness makes him dangerous for you, because anybody who has mental illness is dangerous. And you're part of the regular public, and he's part of the sick, unwell public. And the two should not intermingle, because I think I like you a lot and I don't want to see you suffer. And anybody who associates with the mentally ill will suffer. Now that's dangerous for Jessica. It's misinforming. It's also academically dishonest in my profession. It's not true. We don't believe those things. And it would also misinform the public if I did that in a more generalized way, like warned them and said, hey, Donald Trump is this dangerous guy because he's specifically mentally ill. And because of that one specific thing, you should vote against him or you should run. Because what I'm doing essentially, Andrew, and let's take it all the way to Donald Trump, we can jump out of the anecdote, is if I say the reason you should not support Donald Trump is because he is a mentally ill person, I'm not indicting Donald Trump, I'm indicting the mentally ill. And I'm asking you, the public, to fear those who suffer from a mental illness, and because they are inadequate or incapable or infirm, they, and therefore Donald, should not be in charge. when a better argument is, don't support Donald Trump because he's a criminal. He would be convicted in any other world, and he should not be president because he is not competent to be president. There's sufficient reasons to reject Donald Trump without having to bring in a medical diagnosis that sort of accidentally also indicts an entire portion of the population.
So I agree as you sort of go to what I would call the other pole from that example. I don't want, right? I mean, this is Mental Health Awareness Month, right? It's part of why you reached out to me and why we're doing this now, and getting it on the calendar at the right amount of time. I do not want to stigmatize those with mental illness, right? So everything you've just said in terms of not characterizing mental illness in the way that you've done, I totally get that. But I guess the question that's sort of still at the core that I'm trying to ask is, if you have access to information that you can convey, how, at what point do you have an ethical duty to convey it? At what point do your ethical duties sort of to the profession prevent you from doing that? So, go back to the John and Jessica example. I love, and this is one of the things I love about your show, that this is part of why I'd be a terrible therapist, right? Like I said it as, okay, it's going to be didactic, right? You're going to tell Jessica, hey, John seems like this could be have real warning signs. You immediately phrase that in a way that is much more helpful and welcoming and in line with the standards of your profession. Not surprised by this. This is why you're good at what you do. But you're still conveying that information, right? And you can do that with Jessica because that's one-on-one and you have a personal relationship with her. And you can say, hey, so let's talk about this and tell me what you see in him. And you're going to ask pointed and leading questions. And and the intent behind that is to get her to realize and see and to convey that information to her.
Well, let me jump in right there, because I think right here I can clarify something, and this may be what's different between a lawyer and maybe somebody in my profession. Mental health and diagnosis is not an indictment. And so there is no getting a leading question to get her to arrive at a conclusion that I have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt this guy has narcissistic personality disorder or bipolar disorder and therefore is unfit to date. You can have bipolar disorder and be president of the United States. That is not a disqualifying reality. It is not. Having a healthcare condition, even a mental health care condition, is not inherently disqualifying. What is disqualifying is a person's behavior. Diagnosis aside, their behavior, if it is not in line with the competencies and best practices and the expectations of your office, you are disqualified from that office because of the behavior and the consequences of it, not because of your medical condition, which may have influenced that behavior. So no, I don't have a leading thing, but actually, if I can, I'll put you on cross-examination, good sir.
Okay.
I have a counter question.
I want to come back to this. So just
go ahead. I'll let you finish your thought.
No,
finish your thought.
No.
No, you're the guest. You're the guest.
I'm not ducking out. So ask me the tough question here.
I think you and I actually completely agree on this idea of the principle that I do not have a bigger duty to warn than I do an obligation to the patient. And I think that you have the same principle in your profession. And I've even heard you on your show defend this principle. And I've heard you defend it to even Thomas and to other people. And you'll defend it as privileged communication or executive privilege. And I've heard you talk about that where, okay, does the president get to ask Don McGahn or get to ask his personal attorney, what are the legal consequences if I walk outside and shoot a politician? Or what are the legal consequences of this absolutely obscene, horrific thing? And that lawyer realizes at that moment, oh my God, the President of the United States is contemplating murder or is contemplating something horrific or sending troops to the southern border or is contemplating something completely dictatorial and tyrannical. And I believe, and I might be wrong, and I want your impression on this, I think your answer would be, no, it is actually in the best interest of all law everywhere and in perpetuity, and the best interest of the office of the presidency, that the president have confidence to be able to ask any question of his lawyers without fear that they're going to walk outside and warn the public about what he asked.
Yeah, no, it's. I suspected that might be the question you were posing. I thought you might be even more pointed. So let me say it. Let me say it like this. I totally agree, and in that case where the general principle of attorney-client privilege conflicted with the benefit to be gained from disclosing attorney-client privilege, I would go with the former. So make it this way. Suppose back in the 2000s that I had been engaged to do work for the Donald J. Trump organization, right? And in connection with that work, one of the things that is absolutely ironclad in attorney-client confidentiality is when a client comes to you and confesses to past crimes, you can't ever reveal that without the client's consent. And so Trump comes to me, right? He's hired me to do that. And then in the context of that representation, he says, oh, yeah, well, we got to tread lightly here because, I killed a guy in 1997. Right? No, seriously, right? Like,
right.
I have not had a client tell me that they killed a guy in 1997, but I have had similar unexpected revelations, right? And what I always use with my clients, I guess this betrays my age a little bit, but I will tell them, hey, look, you can tell me you were the second shooter on the grassy knoll, and I can't, it would be amazing, right? It's going to be hard, but for the rest of my life, I have to sit on that, right? So Donald Trump comes to me and in furtherance of seeking legal advice, confesses to past crimes, then he runs for office. It would be very, very useful to the American public to defeat Donald Trump for me to breach attorney-client confidentiality and go, hey, look, this guy told me that he's committed crime, right? And you're right. I absolutely would not do that.
It's an interesting thing. I often talk to my clients when I first meet them, and we go over HIPAA, we go over confidentiality, and we talk about their protections and how I'm never going to, use anything against them. And there's a saying that sometimes we'll use in a cheeky way, whenever we're challenging somebody to tell us the truth and stop dancing around something, we'll say, hey, there's two people in your life you never lie to, your shrink and your lawyer. Yeah. and I think it's interesting that we're able to say that. Sometimes I'll also include your tailor. It's like you're only hurting yourself.
Right.
Let the tailor know the truth. But it's interesting because in both of our professions, what I think I hear you saying in that, Andrew, is when you look at the consequences to law itself and the general, because I've heard you talk about this on the show, I've really admired this point. You've talked about how even somebody who is a racist KKK member or a terrible person or the Boston bomber, they deserve counsel. They deserve to have a defending attorney, and that attorney is not a bad person for taking the case. That attorney is living out a principle that we hold dear. And so I know that you very much understand and appreciate the principle of what having a legal defense means and how that it's inherent to freedom. And it's really a constitutional guarantee.
That goes back. That's a founding principle of our country, right? That is John Adams defending the redcoats who shot the kids during the Boston Massacre, right? And
it's interesting because if you had knowledge that Donald Trump had conspired with the Russians, but he told you this when you were his contracted attorney, and now in the aftermath you're thinking, oh my God, Mueller missed it. I have it. I have the bullet. I know. And then you too would feel that conflict of duty to warn versus the damage I could potentially do to all humans in our country who ever might seek the profession of law. And at some point, even though duty to warn affects 330 million Americans who currently live here and billions more worldwide in a very real sense, there is another part of you that would feel that conflict of, but what about the very principle itself of law and the ability of a person to trust that their lawyer will not sell them out? I do not want to wound or damage that relationship, that very sacred, privileged place between a client and their attorney. And that's how I feel as a shrink, is I think I could do way more damage to the profession of healthcare and to the sacred relationship. If you think about it, you're going back in history explaining your profession. I'll do that a little. The Hippocratic Oath actually was born out of this idea that Hippocrates and those who were considered healers at the time could easily kill a vulnerable person. If they were walked into a home to save somebody, they could easily poison them with the same medication, just in a higher dose, and nobody would know. That person could do whatever they wanted. And it was because the public trust was inherently necessary for civilization to march forward and for people to be healed that the Hippocratic Oath was begun, that we choose to do no harm. And that's the one thing, is that you can trust a doctor, you can trust a lawyer. They're not going to betray you. Now, if it's your divorce attorney, that might be a little different. If it's your wife's attorney, they're going to get you too. But in our case, at least, we're supposed to do no harm. But reflect on that a little bit. I mean, are we coming to a place where we find that we resonate with each other? I mean, does this privilege thing sound like something that kind of brings you to the middle a little?
Well, I certainly think there are analogs. I would point out, and I'm curious if your ethics rules have the same sort of escape hatch to it. I always follow up the grassy knoll statement with the admonishment that as your lawyer, I can't assist you in planning new crimes, right? So the hypothetical you gave, right, like of it is I think, right, I have the direct evidence of conspiring with the Russians to overthrow American democracy, that becomes a closer case, right? Because presumably we're not talking, right? If I've shot somebody, if my client has shot somebody, that moment terminated, right? That is a discrete act that's over and in the past and is not continuing into the present. Conspiracy with the Russians presumably continues into the present, and at that point, you have, as a lawyer, you have a duty to report that and not to collaborate with your client to commit future crimes, and I think that's the right balance as well, right? Like the consequence in the alternative, I've talked about this on the show too, is that then basically the mafia just keeps a lawyer present at everything, right? And and
I remember this, and then just says it was all privileged communication,
right? And
and you don't. I remember you talking about that.
That would be equally terrible,
right?
At the end of the day, I can also envision a situation in which, if I had, even if it was sort of truly past activity, I could envision a situation of saying, of engaging in civil disobedience, right? Of saying, hey, look, I'm breaking the law. I'm breaking my canons of ethics here. I understand that I should be disbarred. I understand that I should serve jail time for this, but I'm willing to do that because the need is so great. And look, like we're now in an era, we're now in an area that is up to each individual's ethics, right? Like, I mean, that's sort of the definition of where that comes into play. But no, I think, I mean, the answer to the larger question of, how do you balance having information that the general public might not have versus how you acquired that information in the first place and sort of preserving the rules that uphold the system. That's why professions need codes of ethics, right?
Right. It's incredibly complicated. And one of the things I like about it is the way you phrase that. We have to counterbalance preserving the institution of law or preserving the institution of healthcare versus the duty to warn and getting it right and being very, very clear. Often on the show, I've noticed that you'll do things, and I wanted to ask you about this because I think it might be analogous to what we're talking about here. When you're describing somebody else who you may, find distasteful, you'll be very careful sometimes not to use your own words to describe them. You'll read off of Wikipedia, and I know that's got to be a legal thing. That's got to be you. Like Thomas, I'll bet, can say whatever he wants about anybody. but I'll bet you can't. And I think that your right to free speech is somehow limited. Now, maybe I'm completely off base. Maybe you really like Wikipedia. But what's the deal with that?
So there are a couple of reasons behind that. And at its core, right, with a lot of legal, potential legal jeopardy, whenever the law has a standard that is trying to ascertain your subjective intent, that standard is going to vary based on the expectations that the law has of the person who's speaking this, right? So to use an example from the Mueller report, right? We talked about this on the show. The Mueller report goes into damning detail about the Trump Tower meeting, and but ultimately concludes that Donald Trump Jr., despite being present at a meeting in which operatives one step removed from Vladimir Putin offered compromising material on Hillary Clinton in exchange for Donald Trump, the candidate, committing to eliminate or reduce sanctions on Russia as president. That's a crime. But the Mueller report says, as part of that, as part of the criminal statute, we would have to prove that Donald Trump Jr. knew that he was getting something of value from a foreign national, which is the crime. That is the crime, right? It is it is a crime to solicit or receive a thing of value in connection with a campaign from a foreign national. And it says, right, the Mueller report specifically says, and we're concerned that he might be able to say, well, I didn't know that I was getting a thing of value, and therefore I didn't knowingly violate the law. And then the next sentence is really, really telling, because the next sentence says, had it been Paul Manafort, right, a long-standing campaign operative, we would have had no problems concluding that he was aware that this was a criminal violation of the election laws. But there's no evidence that Paul Manafort had anything to do with the Trump Tower meeting, which, again, I think is true. Right. So that principle does apply in the way that you've said it, right? If you have more specified knowledge, the law will then make it easier to infer specific intent. And whenever I am quoting directly from Wikipedia, usually it is because I have said something very, very negative about somebody that I think might sue me. And this actually gets us into the original Goldwater case because as we've talked about on the show, the standard for proving defamation against a public figure is very, very high, right? It is the New York Times versus Sullivan rule. It is, you must show not only that the statement that you've said is false, but that it was made with either knowing falsity or with reckless disregard for the truth. Right? That's the standard if I'm going to libel a public figure. And everybody I talk about on the show is a public figure. Right. At least in the context of what you're doing. And so when I quote from Wikipedia, what I am saying is, hey, look, I cannot possibly have recklessly disregarded whether this statement is true or not, because I went and did research, and I went onto Wikipedia, and other people are saying this in a forum that is constantly vetted. So how can you possibly say that is reckless disregard for the truth? And that is, in fact, right, the sort of answer to my motion to dismiss a defamation lawsuit, because a lot of the people that I about whom I pull no punches are serial litigators, right? I've done several episodes about professional litigation troll Larry Klayman, right? And he's a serial abuser of the litigation process, and I can back that up, right? He has been sanctioned by multiple courts for abusing the litigation process. But when it comes to an opinion, right, I can say probably in a way that you would not. And let me ask you, I can say, crazy person Larry Klayman, tell me if that makes you cringe, right? If I ought
right.
not to,
I was
yeah?
just thinking
Yeah?
what we need to do is Andrew, we need a cooperative here where I can say libelous things that you can't say, and you can say mental health things.
Right. This is the
I
strangers
can't
on a
say-
train kind
We
of.
just we need like a slur exchange.
there we go.
But that's well said. That I see your point there, where because you are a lawyer, because you know better, and I'm glad you brought up Paul Manafort. They threw the book at that dude, and Cohen too, because, and I love when Rachel Maddow will do this. She'll read the transcript of the court hearing, and she always like reads through when the judge asks them, "What is your highest level of education?" And they're like Juris Doctorate, and you can just almost hear the air leave the room, like like any hope that Paul had just died, like because he just acknowledged he knows better, and like he's dead to rights, and that's with great power does come great responsibility. And, on that note, as I quote Spider-Man, one of the things I wanted to bring up with you is one of the things that makes my profession uniquely different. We're talking about the similarities between you and I, and how we have unique burdens in the way we say things and how our words carry more power than other people's do. In my profession, as far as I know, I and the people of my profession are the only people who have extra legal power to take away your freedom without a court, without a hearing, without you even having committed a crime.
Yeah.
We can legal you and place you on a legal hold. And that is based entirely on the public's trust that we will never misuse that power for any personal gain, for any political motivation, or for any subjective reason other than we detect that this person is mentally ill, a danger to themselves and society, and we're going to take away their freedom, and we can command officers of the law to take into custody a citizen of the United States and waive all of their rights. Now, eventually they will be, given a fair hearing and evaluated carefully, but my point, I guess, by bringing that up, our extra legal power to take people into custody against their will, we have an unusual public trust and an unusual public power that almost nobody else has in the entire American society. I don't even think the President of the United States can just point at somebody and command that they be taken into custody. And I think that places an unusual burden on the members of our profession to be extremely judicious and careful, never to violate that public trust.
Yeah, I think you make two really, really good points there. We need to do a follow-up episode on civil commitment and due process because that is it's a real issue, and I would love to pick your brain about it. I'm going to leave it stand for right now because I think that rabbit trail would take us down another hour. But no, I get that. I get that notion of not wanting to betray the public trust. I guess for me, where I came into this, right, and I'm not. I wanted to hear you defend your position, right? I mean, I've heard you argue about it on the show, so I was, I anticipated some of what your responses would be here. When I look at the original Goldberg, I'm conflating. It's Goldwater versus Ginsburg.
Right.
But when I look at that original case, let me tell you, some of the facts that underlie that case, right? Like it is very clear to me, right? And this is in the Second Circuit opinion. It quotes from Borison, so this is Fact Magazine, right? And Ginsburg was the owner and the publisher, and then the managing contributing editor was Warren Borison. Borison wrote a letter to labor union leader Walter Reuther, right? And in that letter he said, "Hey, look, I'm putting together a hit piece on Barry Goldwater, right?
Right.
He
basically
I'll read it exactly.
admitted it.
It says, I'm writing an article for Fact about an old enemy of yours, Barry Goldwater.
Yeah.
It's going to be a psychological profile, and it will say, basically, that Goldwater is so belligerent, suspicious, hot-tempered, and rigid because he has deep-seated doubts about his masculinity." That's That's what we call a bad document, right? If you're if you're Borison's lawyer, right? That's a bad one. But when you read the case, what you see is somebody misusing the veneer of psychiatry to take out a political hit piece. Right.
Yes.
And so, even so the headline on in Fact Magazine was 1,189 psychiatrists say Goldwater is psychologically unfit to be president. Right.
Right.
And what the lawsuit shows, and by the way, the lawsuit was a defamation lawsuit under the New York Times v. Sullivan standard that Goldwater won. Right, so
he did win it.
He got nominal damages of $1, but then he got punitive damages of $25,000 and $50,000 respectively against each of the two defendants.
Which is $50 trillion by today's standards.
Yeah, right. Give or take, but I think your math is basically correct there.
I do psychology. I don't do math.
but so. If in order to meet that New York Times v. Sullivan standard, right? Like I just said, you had to be aware that either what you were saying was false or recklessly disregard whether it was true or not. So the case goes through how this rose to that level. So to get the 1,189 number, what they did was they sent out a questionnaire to over 12,000 psychiatrists. Right. And that just had a single question on it. Right. Check the box. Yes or no. Do you like me? No. Check the box. Yes or no. Do you think Barry Goldwater is psychologically fit to be president? Right. Now, again. Right. And in fact, that is. I did that off the top of my head. I'm going to read the question directly. Do you believe Barry Goldwater is psychologically fit to serve as president of the United States? Yes or no? So already, right, I could see a psychiatrist answering that without thinking they were giving a diagnosis, right? I mean, that's a pretty straightforward
just an
question.
opinion.
But even then, they sent it to over 12,000. 10,000 of those folks just threw it away.
Right.
2,400.
We don't read mail.
2,400 responded. And of those 2,400, 571 said, I don't know enough about Senator Goldwater to answer that question. 657 said yes. 1,189 said no. Okay. So that showed that, I mean, the way I would interpret that as a lawyer, as a student of political science is, okay, there was like once you kind of, most people said, not going to answer that. Of the ones who did answer it, there was probably a 2-to-1 preference for Lyndon Johnson over Barry Goldwater. And in fact, the contemporaneous evidence shows that in professions like psychiatry, in highly educated professions, there was a 2-to-1 or greater preference for Lyndon Johnson over the Republican candidate in 1964. This is not surprising. Lyndon Johnson won, an overwhelming landslide, the largest Democratic landslide in
landslide Lyndon.
Which, by the way, you know the original landslide Lyndon story, right?
Yeah, it was a joke. It was at his expense.
Yes, his first Senate election, I think 1956. He outright stole that election. Robert Caro's "The Path to Power" tells the story. It's such a great book. But yeah, he won by 87 votes, and they can prove that there were at least 200 fraudulent. They know that because there was a 700 that was turned into a 900. You can see the picture of the 7 made into a 9 with a circle drawn around it, right?
Yes.
So he and
they called him Landslide Lyndon.
And Landslide Lyndon. I mean, Lyndon Johnson went and introduced himself to folks in the Senate as, "Hi, I'm Landslide Lyndon." So
he owned it.
So it took brass ones. That's for sure.
He's got one of my favorite quotes. I was actually a U.S. history teacher before I got into psychology. And there's I don't remember if this is apocryphal or not, but allegedly he was talking to some junior politician whose bill he had just massacred in some kind of format, and he said, "Sorry, son, I just wanted my unfair advantage." And, his point is like, there's no way that I'm going to fight fair. Like, if I can in any way steal, beg, borrow, I'm going to do it. But anyway, your point about, that trial, I think it makes it so well said. And I think what you're painting in that picture is even in the results of the survey, the editors of this paper, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they seem to be deeply misrepresenting the data, right?
Yes. Look, yeah, and right, and I haven't gotten into right. I mean, they edited letters together. They misattributed. They called. They used misleading answers on or misleading attributions to people who. Because almost all of the surveys that were returned anonymously. Well, the magazine published the more scathing ones of those as name withheld, right? Well, and name withheld, right, conveys something a lot different than I didn't put my name on this at all, right? And so, they edited certain responses together, and I mean, it was clear that it was dishonest. It was clear that it was a hit piece, and so what I wanted to explore, and again, I think we've done a good job with that in this conversation, is okay. I get that we don't want people to use the veneer of psychiatry to mask a political hit piece, right? And I think with Trump there is certainly some risk of that, right? The idea that I call Donald Trump a criminally insane game show host every episode, right? That's and I'm standing by that. And if
not here to question it, that's fine. But insane is not a diagnostic word; it is a legal term. There's a legal defense,
dude. I am using it solely as a slur, so and not as a legal.
Interesting how you backed away from that, Andrew.
I have made no legal determination that he is insane. Right. I am using it only as an insult.
But the record show.
Yeah, so be. If I try and put the imprimatur of a professional on that, I agree. Right, there's something that doesn't sit right with me either. But I do think, and I think it's worth having the discussion. Like we had that with Trump there does seem to be, and I guess I would put it to you this way, right? Barry Goldwater had 40 years of public service before he ran for president, and another 20 years after he lost. And so, in my view, there was, if you want to draw a distinction, right? The whole the slur of, right, in your guts, he's nuts, right? That the idea, like I quoted, I quoted from the letter to Walter Reuther, that the idea was to say this guy is just unhinged. It's 1964. It's the height of the Cold War. He's going to get in. He's going to push the button. I can see why, in retrospect, that that would make people uncomfortable.
Oh, I get it.
Donald Trump is somebody with zero public service, zero civic activity, right? His charities are criminal organizations. That's true. That is a legal conclusion, by the way.
That is a fact.
And is a fact. He has never done anything for anyone and he's 71 years old, and he was elected president. And so it seems like it is sort of even more acute in those circumstances to say, well, we don't have any idea how this person is going to react to the circumstances of the presidency. And so in those situations, I do want more information from the professionals who are able to tell me, well, look, people like this tend to react in this way in these kinds of circumstances, right? What do you think of that?
I think that what I hear you saying there is I hear you saying, Jim, as a member of the public, having limited access to information about this fella, I would probably want somebody who has more information to share that. My argument back would be, I don't have more information than you. We have access to the same sets of facts, and the same things that scare you and make you feel that he's unqualified would be the same things that I would conclude. Now, I might feel tempted to use more mental health language to describe certain patterns that I see or whatever, but I wouldn't even feel confident rendering a diagnosis regarding any of those attributes, having not personally evaluated the man. And I think in the same way that we're unsatisfied with William Barr rendering a summary judgment, having not even evaluated the evidence. And we all look at that and go, dude, that's malpractice. You should be disbarred. You shouldn't even have the job. And I think that more dangerous than, it would be more dangerous, I guess, if we in the psychological community raised our voices not having access to all the information, than for us to sit silently and let society draw its conclusions based on the same visual information that we have. We have an expertise that only renders itself when we have full access to a human being to evaluate them. And it is a very nuanced trade. It is very hard to do from afar. It really requires a human interaction. Medicine is a science, yes. It is also an art. And we describe it as a practice. And it is because it has all these ethereal components to it that I know I don't feel comfortable rendering a diagnosis. And I think that the other thing that I'd want the public to understand, and when I think about Goldwater, the lesson from Goldwater to me is not the nuances of how libel works. The lesson of Goldwater to me is, if I ever give a member of the media or a politically motivated person the weapon of my credentials to use against their opponent, they will use them however they see fit, and I will have no control over how they wield that sword. That's a dangerous thing. It's dangerous if I diagnose Donald Trump and then somebody says, see, conservatives are psychopaths, and then there really is a sociopathic personality disorder member of the conservative coalition who really would kill people, and now they don't get help because they feel like, well, I'm not going to confirm the stereotype or whatever. I just see all of this as way too problematic for us to get involved in. Our powers, and I make myself sound all freaking deified here, but I just feel like our social responsibility is too great, and it's been abused in the past, and we just have to withhold that.
No, I think that's really, really well said, and I think where you've drawn the line to say that part of the harm here is attaching the credential to the opinion, right? I mean, and that's something that I try really hard not to do on the show, right? Like, I never ever want anybody to say, oh, is this constitutional? Well, Andrew's a lawyer and he said it's constitutional, therefore it is. Right? Like, I mean,
don't take legal advice from a podcast.
Right. Well, and it's why I don't ever answer the lightning round questions in 30 seconds, right? Like, it takes 45
They're
minutes
nuanced.
because I want to walk you through, because right, like you rendering a diagnosis, right? When I say I'm confident that this is constitutional, what I mean is I'm 90% confident, right? Like, I'm 92%, right? Like, it means that I have put a very high probability on something, but that it doesn't mean that even in situations where I say I'm confident that it's X, sometimes that means, look, you could still write a defensible argument that it's not X, right? Sometimes you can't, right? Like the Jared Kushner rule, for example, right? It is 100% crystal clear that the Anti-Nepotism Act was meant to prohibit a president's family, including his son-in-law. It's explicitly defined in the statute, from serving in any capacity, right? And so, no, you can't have your son-in-law be White House chief of staff, even though you got a lawyer to write it's okay if he doesn't take a salary. That is nonsense, right? And so, but with the exception, that's like when you drive past the sign that says speed limit 55 and you're going 78, right? Like, right? There's no argument there. But by and large, there's always an argument, right? And so when I render an opinion, I'm rendering it with error bars around it, with in a probabilistic fashion, and I want you to know the thought process I used to get to that opinion. And I hear you saying what I think is something very similar, right? Which is, I don't want it to be my credentials trust me on the bottom line and therefore agree with what I've said.
Right.
And I'm wondering if there is a way then to sort of have that conversation and say, look, don't look to me to make a diagnosis of this person, right? The facts are they are out there. You can render your own opinion as well as I could, about this in a non-professional way, right? What does it say about somebody who, the person whom they hired to write a hagiography says that that person has little ability to comprehend what's going on around them, in conversations that last longer than 20 minutes.
And actually, I'll jump in right there because that's a great point, and I want to zoom in on that quote. And this is where I think I want to push members of America and both of our audiences to think differently. If somebody says, what does it mean that the co-author of this book described him as having an inability to concentrate on conversations that last longer than 20 minutes? What does that mean? It means he's not qualified to make big decisions as the President of the United States. And you don't have to add another dot in that. It's A to B. What does that mean? It means he's unqualified. What does that mean? It means he can't concentrate. What does that mean? Concentration's important at this job. He can't do it. He shouldn't have the job. We don't have to take this scenic route where we go ahead and grab a diagnosis on the way there to put armor around that statement. And that's the point I want to make, is that there's so many thousands of observations that tell you as the American public that this guy should probably not be in charge. You don't need me to wrap those observations in another layer and add medical language to make them definitive. It's not necessary.
Yeah.
You can see it for yourself. And I can potentially do too much harm by doing that, and that's why I refrain.
I am persuaded by that. I think that's really, really well put. And I would amplify that to say, to sort of wrap back in your stigmatization point, because the fact that somebody is not does not have attributes that make them well suited for the job of President of the United States does not make them a bad person, right? It means you shouldn't vote for them, but you could say, I mean, I think Donald Trump is a bad person for lots of other reasons, right? Like, but you don't need to, cast negative aspersions about Donald Trump that would then be attributed to a class of people, because the fact that he's ill-suited to be president, right? Like, I'm ill-suited to play center field, right? It'd be right because I'm 45 and I'm 5'7" and I'm overweight, right? Like, but that doesn't. Right, that doesn't mean that I'm not well suited for other tasks, right? So,
and
I
it's
think
not
that's
an
a really
indictment on who you
Yes.
are, and I appreciate you meeting me in the middle on that.
Yeah.
As you and I have noted, and I appreciate you bringing this up earlier, it is hashtag Mental Health Awareness Month, which you have so graciously come onto our show to support that, and you guys have always been big proponents of protecting and defending populations of humans who are often overlooked or who are often victimized. You have stood up for gay and lesbian people, trans people. You and Thomas both have banged the drums louder than anybody when it comes to the ban in the military and demographics of humans that get taken advantage of or somehow are painted under a certain light that is just not accurate. A person is not disqualified from military service for being trans. They're disqualified from military service because their aim is terrible and they keep shooting, the other guy's targets.
Yeah.
Don't put that guy in the field. For that reason alone, it has nothing to do with anything else. And when it comes to mental health, I just want to really echo and amplify what you just said, which is, and this is the area I think we've come to agree together, what disqualifies a person from office or from any job is their competence and ability to perform the tasks expected of them, not their health. If Donald Trump goes home every night and cries himself to sleep because he is secretly depressed, that does not disqualify him from office. If he then makes a decision in a state of depression and says, you know what, who cares about the economy, everything's going to fail anyway and the dollar's make-believe, and then the economy crashes, we should fire him for that action. That one. Yeah. Like, that's it. Fire him for that. He was unqualified to rule the economy. But what led to that, the background noise, all humans are susceptible to mental health. It includes too many of us for it to be a disqualifier, and it tends to push people away and stigmatize. And so, you know, I'm just really encouraged and heartened by what you said, Andrew. I think that you nailed it on the head.
Well, I appreciate the kind words. I was moved by your point on deterring individuals, the stigmatization point, right? Like if you say, you know, all conservatives are psychopaths, like I want that conservative to get
help,
the treatment
yes,
and the help that they need. That's right, and that is at the end of the day, I think that's, you know, what it's about, and I am persuaded.
Yay!
I really, yay! Good work.
I got one.
There you go. Don't tell anybody that.
I'm telling everybody.
Won this argument.
Also, I recorded this whole conversation. I don't know if I was legally supposed to tell you that.
I'm pretty sure that Nevada is a one-party consent state. So
yeah, we have almost no laws here. It's just Wild West. We mostly just duel it out.
There you go, and, libertarian paradise.
Oh my God, yeah, we want to be. Jeez. But Andrew, I cannot thank you enough. You and Thomas have been just such huge advocates. You guys have been very supportive this month, and you've been pointing people in the right direction. Coming on this show is a nod in that direction. You've been very gracious. It is very important to me that everybody listening to this understand that there is no shame in having any kind of mental health concern. That does not make you lesser of a human. You deserve health care, and it's okay to go ahead and get treatment. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with that, and that's what Mental Health Awareness Month is all about. And what you guys are doing on Opening Arguments is great work. Everybody needs to check it out. Opening Arguments. You can get it anywhere you get podcasts. It's also one of the most happening Twitter accounts I've ever seen is at OpenArgs. It's my favorite. I follow everything you guys do. The only thing about you guys that is unacceptable is Thomas's blind allegiance to the San Jose Sharks. As a Vegas Golden Knight guy, that's unacceptable to me. And I've decided in my benevolence to overlook that. And I want you to know how hard it was that I still subscribe to the show despite that.
I appreciate that. I mean, you guys are essentially arguing about soccer on ice, so I mean, you know, it's a challenge for me to get overly worked up about it. But
I know you're a baseball guy. Who's your team? I've never heard you talk about it on the show. Who's your team?
So my team is actually there are two teams that I root for right now. One, because of a professional relationship, is the Philadelphia Phillies. And but the team that I am a passionate, hardcore fan about is the Tampa Bay Rays. And,
oh wow! You're a Rays fan.
Yeah,
very cool.
I'm a Rays fan for a couple of reasons. Number one, because you know they need at least one, right?
They need at least one fan.
It is like. Because of the structure of baseball, right? The being a fan of the Rays is like being a fan of you know the team that is playing the game on extra hard mode, right? With the difficulty turned all the way up. It's structurally, you know, they're operating under conditions that no other team could operate on.
It's heroic, really.
It really, and so as a result, they are doing things. And have continued to do things since Stu Sternberg bought the team back in 2002, 2003. No, I guess Sternberg bought the team in 2005. But in any event, in the mid 2000s, and they have done just really crazy cutting edge stuff, which the baseball geek in me loves. That also, I would take the Rays AAA team is in Durham, North Carolina. Bull Durham, right?
Yeah,
which is not only an amazing place to see a game, but they do a baseball camp a couple of times every summer, and I had taken my son down there every year, sometimes twice per summer, from when he was 5 until when he was about 14 or 15. And unlike a lot of teams that right, like they would have the AAA players like working the camp, right? And the Rays have more AAA players come up to the majors, right, because of how it works than any other team. So so my son got to meet all of these ball players, right, when they were in AAA, and and so he just got this amazing experience of kids who then became big leaguers 6 months later, and we would go and they would come over and and chat with my son, and
oh my gosh,
so it was such a great and then how can you not root for those guys? So
I love it. It's funny because I'm a Cubs fan.
Okay,
and I'm from Chicago, and so I've earned it. But it's funny because up until 2016, people were very kind to us. If I was at a bar watching a Cubs game, if I had a hat on, people pick up the tab. They'd come over and go, hey, 2010, guys would be like, hey, man, you got a safe place to go tonight? Are you okay? You got a friend? It's just all pity. It was all pity until 2016. Now nobody cares.
Right. Well, we need to have a Joe Madden conversation. So, but that's going to be beyond the scope of this one, I think. But
I think you're right.
Yeah.
But Belt and Suspenders lawyer Andrew Torrez, co-host of Opening Arguments, the best law podcast that you will ever find on the interwebs. Find it, subscribe to it, download it, patron it. They are wonderful guys. Mr. Torrez, thank you so much for being my guest on Pod Therapy. You are a gentleman and a scholar, sir.
Oh, I thank you so much for having me on. This was a lot of fun, and I'm not sure I deserve the high degree of the effusiveness of your praise, but I will take it. And thank you for the kind words. Yes.
Thanks for coming on, sir.
Yep.